Good morning. If you're coming in right now, yes, I am talking to myself. Actually, I'm not. I'm just monologuing. I'm talking and hoping people are there. I'm going to begin talking about the difference between awareness and acceptance. So, my 23-year-old daughter texted me over the weekend and said, "How do I stop myself from impulse spending?" And I took a screenshot. I took a photo of what I was doing, and I was buying things online. So I took a photo and I sent it back and I said, "Why would you ask me?" But then I engaged in a serious discussion with her around knowing the difference between tuning into what's really happening for us and or pathologizing ourselves. So when we talk about, when my daughter texted me and said, "How do I stop myself from impulse spending?" I said, let's take a moment and think about this for a sec first before we move ahead and think that that's what's going on. Are we impulse spending? And do we think that because we have a diagnosis of ADHD? Or are we just spending money on something that we like and we can afford, and that's what's happening? It's very common and very easy for neurodivergent folks to have in our minds what the textbooks say about us and to make everything we do, think, say and be and feel about what's in the books about us. This is called pathologizing ourselves. So we're looking at the pathology attached to the letters that we identify with or have been diagnosed with and making everything about that. When people who are not ADHD go and spend money on things frivolously, I don't know whether they panic and say, "How do I stop myself from impulse spending?" Or when they are spending money that they do have on things that they enjoy, I wonder if the first thing they think is, "Oh my gosh, I'm doing that thing, I'm impulse spending." We give ourselves such a hard time as neurodivergent folks, don't we? The first thing we do as neurodivergent people is we go to all of the things the books say about us. I think the hardest part about this is that when you're neurodivergent, whether you know it or not, whether you are identified or not, you've given yourself a hard time. We give ourselves an awfully hard time. Internalized ableism, being down on ourselves. When you don't know that you're neurodivergent, you have a lot of expectations of yourself. And in my experience, I spent my life just riddled with what I believed were failures. Why can't I do this like other people? I moved between, why can't I do this basic thing, and, okay, I'll just try a different therapy. I'll try a different therapy and I'll get better at this thing. One day, in my head, I thought, one day, I'm going to be a normal person. I just need a lot of help to get there. And let me tell you, I almost have an expert knowledge on the millions of different types of therapeutic approaches for people because I've tried so many. I had bookcases filled with self-help books written by so many different people. I was fascinated with psychology. I was in 12-step groups. I did so many different courses trying to learn about myself. I kept journals. I did programs. I believed at one point, oh, it's just my body. I'm really unhappy with my body. If I fix that, I'll be good. Then it was about how I looked, and then it was about the friends I had, and then it was about my environment, so I would move around a lot, always trying to find the answer to why I struggled so much in life outside of myself. Thinking, what is it that I need to overcome? Imagine wasting your life thinking that you need to be someone you're not, thinking that you're inherently flawed and disordered, And then when I was identified neurodivergent, guess what? It didn't change that for me. I had textbooks to confirm what I already believed about myself. So here's the thing. I often say, when I was diagnosed autistic, my whole life made sense. It did. Being identified autistic answered every question I ever had about myself. It explained to me every challenge that I ever had. But it didn't shift me away from thinking that I was inherently flawed. And that is the difference between, for me, awareness and acceptance. I was aware that I was autistic, but the information I still had about that was from a medical disorder perspective. So I continued to pathologise myself through the eyes of those god-awful textbooks written by non-autistic folks. I still saw myself as flawed. Okay, this makes sense. I'm autistic. Yes, I am disordered. So I sat with that for a number of years. I have a disorder, ASD. This is why I struggle so much when people refer to themselves or their children as ASD, because it stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder. And today, I have enough respect for myself and love for myself that I don't refer to myself as a disorder. And I think that that's really important. So I continued on in my life thinking, okay, yeah, I have this disorder. And I found community, but I sat in spaces with other autistic people who believed that they were disordered as well. And all we talked about was what therapies we were doing and was it helping, and what books have we read and what professionals have we seen, and who do we follow on social media that's an expert in ASD. And it was always somebody who was not autistic. So that internalized understanding and externalized belief that I was inherently flawed and disordered still stayed with me, even though being identified autistic was transformative for me. And so what happened after that was my focus stayed with my children who are autistic. I need to find solutions. I need to find solutions. I need to find solutions for everything, which brings me back to pathologizing. I run programs and I sit in space with families and I do these lives and I answer a lot of questions, and it's not surprising that the most common theme for families raising neurodivergent children is bringing a situation and asking, what do I do about this? Bringing a behavior and saying, what do I do about this? And it's because we continuously pathologize everything that neurodivergent people do. Of course, what we learn to do during that initiation process of our children being identified neurodivergent is we're told that they need therapies and they need all of this. And therapies, don't get me wrong, they're wonderful when they're necessary, and they're wonderful when they're supportive, and they're wonderful when they are focused on the individual needs of the human being, because we're not treating autism, we are supporting needs, which will change and fluctuate across the entire lifespan of a neurodivergent person. So I was fixated on finding solutions for everything that happened in my family home. My child wanted to sleep on the floor and not in their bed, so I had to find solutions and drive myself just to extreme anxiety, trying to figure out, how do I get my child to sleep in their bed? It's not okay that they're on the floor. They need to be sleeping in a bed. People sleep in beds. Who bloody cares? Who cares if our children want to sleep on the floor? How do I get my child to sit at the table while they're eating? And in the therapies we were engaged in, those were goals. Let's write down every meal they have, what they eat, what they're doing during the meal, why they're not sitting at the table. We've got to get a formula for this, get the data, extract the information, come up with a way to make the child sit at the table. I mean, come on. Is this real life? Is this how we're spending our lives as families? Just fixating on how to get our children to sit at a table to eat a meal, or how to get our child to stop sleeping on the floor and sleeping in a bed. So you can see the difference there between awareness and acceptance. The awareness for me was, okay, I am autistic, but it didn't mean anything for me. It meant that I was disordered. Acceptance is, oh, I'm autistic. There's an identity and culture behind that. That means that I'm not supposed to be like other people. So what does it mean for me to be autistic? And when I began to immerse myself in spaces with self-accepting and self-embracing and self-celebrating autistic folks, then I began to learn about identity and culture, and it changed my life. It changed our family because it meant I could start to like myself. When I started to learn that it's okay for our children to have an iPad at the table while they eat, or to eat in the lounge room, because sometimes it'll mean the difference between them eating or not eating if I'm fixating on them eating at the table. If being in the lounge room with an iPad and their meal in front of them means that they will eat, then that's what's important. It comes down to basic needs. If a child is going to sleep 8 hours on the floor and not at all in a bed, then we let them sleep on the floor. This is the difference between awareness and acceptance. If I have a situation where one of my children continues to attack the other one randomly during play, do I come at that situation by knowing that that's what happens, but repeating the scenario and trying different solutions or punishments or consequences for that child? Awareness. Or do I know that this is what happens, so I set the scene differently? I make changes. I look at the triggers. I look at what might be leading to that happening. I encourage different play. I learn about how my children thrive and how they like to play, rather than how I think they should be playing. Acceptance. Acceptance means understanding that neurodivergence is not a disorder. It is a naturally occurring variation of neurobiologies. We don't just have a different neurotype. We have a completely different neurobiology. Our central nervous system, our peripheral nervous system, our sensory processing, our brains, our bodies, the way we process food, the way we process chemicals, our immune systems. There are even particular illnesses that we share when we are autistic. This is evidence that it is just another form of normal. We don't look at non-autistic people and go, oh gosh, they all like socializing. They love a barbecue and a beer. What can we do about that? Let them go to the barbecue for half an hour, have half a beer and then come home. And hopefully over time, they'll learn that being introverted and a recluse is better for their mental health. We don't do that, right? But we have this done to ourselves. From the time we are identified neurodivergent, we are pathologized. Everything we do is looked at through a lens of pathology. When we look at our children and they do something that's not what we expect, because when we were waiting for our children to come into the world, we read all of the books about typical children. And when our children don't hit those milestones when we expect them to, if they're not neurodivergent, we say, well, that's okay, they'll catch up. It's no problem, they'll catch up. All children move ahead on their own timeline. But if we know they're neurodivergent and they're not hitting those milestones, holy hell, We come up with data and plans and solutions and approaches and therapies and professionals, and we make a plan. They have to hit this milestone by this time, or they won't function in the real world. We just completely lose sight of humanity. These are children we're talking about. Why do children get to hit particular milestones in their own time when they're not autistic? And when they are, they don't get to. They don't get to just be who they are, explore the world as who they are. And then, people have questions around, I've heard an occupational therapist once say in a podcast that a non-speaking autistic child didn't know who their own family was, didn't recognise their mother as their mother. What utter bollocks. It's not true. That is just such a gross expression of ableism. When you're not autistic, you don't get to look at autistic people and decide who we are, and look at all of our behaviours and decide what they mean and where they come from, because you don't know. You just don't know. When we are young and we may be non-speaking, it's because our native tongue is energy, how environments feel, how people feel. Do they feel safe? When we are young, we are processing so much sensory input because our sensory processing is not like other people. It is all-consuming. We are hypersensitive in every respect of the word. And so taking in all that information all of the time through all of our sensory systems can be absolutely disarming. It can cause us to shut down. It can cause us to melt down. It can be confusing, and it can occur at any time. This is why I think it's so important to know the difference between awareness and acceptance, and to approach, situations that we have in our family homes from that perspective. Am I aware that this is happening and still trying to make it something it's not? Am I trying to change it and fix it because I think this is how it should be? Or am I aware that this is happening and accepting it and going, okay, what can I do around this to make it easier? Or what can I just accept and go, okay, this is just neurodivergent culture. Like we said before, maybe our child doesn't eat at the table for meals. It doesn't matter. Maybe our child cannot brush their hair every day because maybe we can't imagine the incredible pain that is felt from having our hair brushed. Our heightened sensitivity means that we will often just feel pain to a degree that people could never imagine. Or maybe we don't feel anything. Or maybe we feel it the same as you. Maybe our children can't shower every day because the sound of the shower hitting the hard floor sends searing pain through our body. Because for me, having auditory processing differences means that if there is a sudden unexpected noise, I feel rage inside because my threat response goes off and I go into protective mode. My brain tells me I'm about to die, so the anger floods my body in order to prepare me for fight. It's a threat response. If I hear something that's really loud or a particular sound, it's not just about volume, then it sends pain through my whole body in shock waves. So it's so important to really explore neurodivergent identity and culture. It's really important to know that we're not typical people with a side of neurodivergence that can be treated or wished away. We're not typical, and I hate that word, but I'm using it because it's something everybody understands and it's easy. We're not typical people with a little bit of autism. I am completely neurodivergent. The way I think, the way I feel, the way I process my environment, the way I see, smell, feel with my hands, hear things, the way my vestibular input feels, the way I move proprioceptively, all of that is influenced by my neurodivergent neurobiology. There's nothing typical about me. There is nothing non-autistic about me. We have got to stop seeing people as typical with a little bit of autism, because it's not a thing. It's not a thing. There's no mild autism, severe autism. There are different expressions of being autistic, and we all have varying sensory profiles and wants and needs and support needs and likes and dislikes, and we've got to stop pathologizing ourselves and autistic folks. You know, this whole thing about being in families, and like I was sharing my own story before about trying to find solutions for everything that even shifted outside that ridiculous realm of what's considered typical or neuronormative. Trying to find solutions that are neuronormative to neurodivergent behaviours is absolutely fruitless. First of all, it's not meant to be. It's not the neurodivergent way, and it can traumatise people. It instills a poor sense of self, identity crisis. We are not typical people. We're neurodivergent people. We have our own identity and culture. We're not disordered. We're disabled, which is a naturally occurring variation of human being. There are all different kinds of disability, but it's hard for us as families not to attempt to find solutions that are centered in neuronormativity for our neurodivergent children, because that's what pathology encourages us to do. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a DSM. We wouldn't have a criteria that we check off. That criteria, they're deficits. So we're already looked at in the assessment process of needing to check off a list of things that are wrong with us, that are not neuronormative. It's like taking a dog and ticking it off a checklist of what cats are like. They are two completely different things. Two completely different things. But it's hard not to do that because professionals are trained academically to do the same thing. Social skills training is a perfect example of that. There are so many therapies that are geared toward neuronormativity. It riddles society. This idea that there is one normal, acceptable way to be in the world, and anything outside of that needs a solution, needs a strategy. I know that a lot of people will be doing their best to live in radical acceptance. And isn't it sad that we call it radical acceptance when we're talking about accepting human beings as they are? It's even sadder that usually when we use that terminology, it's around minority groups. It's around people who are neurodivergent a lot. Radical acceptance. Every time I sit down for a podcast interview or talk to somebody in any capacity, they often say, I love that you talk about radical acceptance. And I'm trying to move away from that, because honestly, when I started out, I was still a lot in the mindset of finding solutions. And now I am about acceptance, but of all people. And it's sad that we should talk about radical acceptance when we're talking about humanity. But it's hard because families are trying to be accepting, but then they're surrounded by systems that are set up to shame us. And, you know, we're looking at schools, we're looking at employers, we're looking at friends and family saying things to us like, are you going to let them get away with that? That's not okay. It might not be okay when we're looking at it from neuronormativity, but we are not neuronormative. We show up in the world in a different way. We express our feelings a different way, a completely different way. I think the last thing that I want to say, because I've got an appointment with a brilliant neurodivergent person, the way that we understand neurodivergence is indicative of pathology and indoctrination of families when their children are identified, because most of us don't even know what autism is. ADHD. We think we do because we've done a course, or we've specialised in the field, or we've gone to uni and we might have even done a master's degree in autism studies. We read textbooks, we do professional development. I can check off all of those boxes, and yet when I had children who were identified autistic, guess what information I was armed with? Absolutely nothing that helped me. Nothing. The degrees, the textbooks, all of it, most of it was written by non-autistic folks. So it was a biased observation of neurodivergent lifestyle, identity and culture, and writing about it as though it was disorder. That's how we pathologized. It's how we started pathologizing in the 40s, and we're still doing it now. And we know that we don't know what neurodivergence is. When parents raising neurodivergent children come and learn from autistic adults and realize that they're autistic, we already know you're autistic. Autistic folks in adult autistic community, we already know that a lot of these parents that we come into contact with, we know within the first 5 minutes whether they're neurodivergent or not. And it's not because we see deficit. It's never about that. It's because we recognize kin, we recognize nuances, we recognize soul language, we recognize that we speak the same language of the heart, we recognize neurodivergent energy. It's never about deficit. That's not our way as neurodivergent people. Never. It's not about deficit. It's about the way we show up in the world. And who we are is beautiful. And what we're doing by immersing neurodivergent people in neuronormative culture and making us disordered is we're killing our spirit. We are robbing autistic people, ADHDers, PDAs, whatever your neurodivergence is, we're robbing ourselves from our rites of passage, because this is our identity and culture. It makes me very sad, very, very sad. Let's put that smile back on. And thank you so much for being here this morning. It's hard, isn't it, for many of our children? That earthquake, if you're in Melbourne, may have been the first example, well, in our family, the first example that our children have of their parents being vulnerable in a situation that they can't control or fix or change for them or protect them from. So that's going to cause a lot of extreme anxiety for many of our kids at the moment, and that's okay. All right, gosh, I love you all. I love this community. I really, really do. Have a wonderful day.